Hi everyone, sorry for the delay in putting up the rest of these clips on the July 14th interview that I conducted with former ambassador to Ukraine, William B. Taylor. I've been up in Rockland, Maine, executing or conducting a backpack journalism workshop for members of the Bronx Documentary Center, an amazing institution that you may want to learn more about. You can check out my Facebook page. I put a couple of pictures up there earlier today of members of the staff, the BDC, as it were, conducting the workshop, executing their documentaries in the field, and some of it's pretty interesting actually. This is the third of 5 clips on the interview with Ambassador Taylor, and I hope to get them all up by the end of this week. As always, never hesitate to contact me. Please feel free to drop me a line. My email address is billgentile@billgentile.com. Okay, here we go. I'll see you after this one is over. Thanks for attending.
I want to move to kind of the second section of our discussion, and whether the West is morally obliged to support Ukraine. And again, for some context, I'm going to read some of what you've already thankfully read for us. And I'm going to do so because it's tied into of something that you haven't read thus far. So let me find my bearings here. There were very few pitched battles between the two armed groups. Instead, the war played out in a series of ambushes or surprise attacks preceded by long stretches of slogging through tropical highlands, through ankle-deep mud, wearing the same wet, filthy, stinking clothes, and humping backpacks stuffed with everything I could carry inside plastic bags to protect my precious camera gear and film from the elements. I walked for days under a burning sun or a tropical downpour in the middle of the jungle, and in an instant, fights erupted and men began to bleed. Then I slogged again, sometimes documenting young Sandinista soldiers or Contras hauling their wounded and their dead. The Contra War resembled the Vietnam War more than it did the Sandinista-led revolution of 1979. And a couple pages later, I write, it was deep into the war and I had established relationships with fighters on both sides of the conflict, Sandinista as well as Contra. During a conversation with one of the fighters, he told me about having dispatched prisoners captured during battle in the northern mountains. Open quote. They had faces like dogs, he said, close quote, as if that were true, as if that made it all okay. And I wondered, what was this young man like before the war? I won't tell you which side of the conflict this young man fought on during the Contra War, because it doesn't matter. Because I believe young men on both sides of just about any conflict in any part of the world could have done the same. You and I, Ambassador Taylor, we know what can happen to men at war because we've seen it. One of my colleagues who also covered the conflicts in Central America warned that he sees, open quote, a similarity between the Ukraine and El Salvador wars. In El Salvador, the US decided it needed to support the regime despite any outrage it committed, including raping, murdering US nuns, and assassinating the Archbishop. Likewise, we have let the Ukrainians know that we are on their side until victory, and nothing they do will change that. This gives license to the bloodiest human instincts, close quote. So my question is, until when is the West morally obliged to support Ukraine? How do we know when it disintegrates into something not so just, something else?
I'm glad you raised the point, Bill, about what young men can do in the war, in a war, in any war, because we have seen and are now investigating and are horrified at the atrocities that the Russians have committed. There's no dispute. So the Russians to the north of Kiev occupied small towns, We know the names of these towns. Bucha. Everybody who's read the paper over the past 2 months knows Bucha, knows Irpin. People who have visited Kiev, heads of state, prime ministers, certainly the Ukrainian president has gone to Bucha. Their UN investigations, human rights investigations, war crimes investigations are going on in Bucha and Irpin and other cities. And they are horrified, exactly what you say, at the crimes, the atrocities, the war crimes. President Biden has called it genocide that they've found, that they've seen. And this might go back. I don't know what's in their heads, Bill. I don't know what's in their heads in this case. But what we know is President Putin, in that long, inaccurate, distorted historical statement about Ukraine, the history of Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine not being a country and not really being sovereign, really just being a part of Russia, that document was distributed to the Russian army, to the Russian soldiers. They were required to read this. So it's not just young men behaving badly because they're young men, and that's what some young men do. No, this was policy. This was policy coming down from the Kremlin, from President Putin himself. And so when these investigations of these atrocities, these war crimes take place, they're going to figure out who's responsible, who gave these orders, who allowed this to happen. We're talking about rapes. We're talking about rapes of children. We're talking about murders in the back of civilians' heads, shots. We're talking about hands tied behind their back and executed, left in the streets. This is horrible. This is war crimes. Now, your point is that our outrage, that our moral standards have to apply across the board. And that's certainly true. Certainly has to apply to the Ukrainians. And we have to apply whatever the process is, whether it's a judicial process in Ukraine, whether it's an international tribunal that goes into and examines the evidence for these atrocities and war crimes. Ukrainians have identified some Russian soldiers already and have put them on trial. And the Russian soldiers have confessed. So there has to be a process. We have to be even-handed. You're absolutely right. We can't just blame one side and not blame the other if there are violations of human rights, of the laws of war. No, we have to do this across the board. And the overwhelming evidence right now, this is not from the United States. This is not from Ukraine. This is from UN. This is from non-governmental organizations. This is from human rights organizations. They have found, in other words, neutral observers, they have found the atrocities attributable to the Russians. If there are Ukrainian violations, and I'm sure there will be, we should hold them to account. The Ukrainians have said themselves they will hold themselves to account. So the Ukrainian authorities have said they will hold their own soldiers to account for any of this kind of behavior. The Russians have not. Indeed, as I say, this might be Russian policy. So again, there's no moral equivalence here. In my view, there's no danger that we're going to give the Ukrainians a blank check to do any of this stuff. No, the Ukrainians have performed, as you have said earlier, heroically in defense of their country, defense of their land, defense of their homes, defense of their families. That's what they're defending. And they've done this heroically, and as far as we can tell, honorably. So I do think we have a moral obligation to support the Ukrainians. They are fighting our fight in some real sense. They are defending Europe from Russia. Russia, if it is able to take over Ukraine, it will then threaten NATO. It'll then threaten Eastern Europe. It'll threaten Poland. It'll threaten Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. And those are NATO allies. They will threaten the Russians. If they are able to take Ukraine, they will threaten the United States. And so Ukraine is really fighting our fight. They are defending Europe. And we have an obligation, I think, both strategic obligation, as well as a moral obligation, to support them and support them as in their fight. At some point, they will be able to sit down and negotiate with the Russians. If they were to do that now, and they've said they're not ready to do it now, but if they were to do it now and agree to a ceasefire in place, that would be ceding a fifth of Ukrainian land to the Russians as a reward for invading, as a reward for the crime of aggression. And Ukraine is not willing to do that. And it's not just President Zelensky who's not willing to do that. It's the Ukrainian people who are not willing to give up Ukrainian land to an aggressor, to the Russians. You know, Bill, the Ukrainians, when I was there in 2006, 2009, so I was there twice. I was there in 2006, 2009, before the first invasion in 2014. And then I went back in 2019 as the acting ambassador, as a charge, and they were at war then. And this was two different Ukraines. So in the first part, when I was there in 2006, 2009, there was a real debate. It's a real democracy. Let's be clear. It's a real democracy. It's changed. The president has gone from one side to the other, back and forth, different party, back and forth 6 times. So it's a real democracy. There's a real debate, real disagreements. When I was there in 2006, 2009, the real debate was whether the country should go more towards Russia or more towards Europe. And there were some legitimate political parties that were advocating to go towards Russia. And there were, in those political parties, there were people who had friends and colleagues and business partners, family in Russia. And there was, you know, good relations among even people in the other parts of Ukraine, in the western part of Ukraine, the northern part, that did not want to go toward Russia. They wanted to go toward Europe, adopt European standards, but it wasn't violent. So that was before the invasion. After the invasion in 2014, and now after this enormous invasion, Ukrainians hate the Russians. It's sad, but it is true. What Putin has done is created a hostile nation on his border, and it's going to be hostile for generations. He has destroyed any hope to live in peace, live in a friendly manner next to this nation. They hate him.
2 follow-up questions, Mr. Ambassador. So you're kind of convinced that there is a mechanism set up that will recognize when, I mean, believe me, everybody is who knows anything about this conflict understands that the Russian forces have been barbaric, and the Ukrainian forces, although we've seen a couple of things that don't look okay, their behavior has been 1,000 times better. But you're convinced there's a mechanism set up that will recognize when things are not being conducted in a just way, and that will somehow put the brakes on the Ukrainians. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say. It is fair to say. The military, it's a new young military. That is, the leaders now, the general officers, are the ones that have come up through the last 8-9 years of war with the Russians. They've been fighting the Russians now since 2014. Yeah. And there's a new generation of leaders and soldiers who have been trained by Americans and other NATO allies and there's an ethos, there's a discipline, there's an understanding of the laws of war, of just war, Bill, exactly what we've been talking about. That is unlike anything that's on the Russian side. The Russians that are still there, and yes, there is a justice system in Ukraine that will bring to justice violators of human rights. Absolutely.
Before we get into the next section, I want to ask one other question in this section, and they're probably the answer to this question I think it would be different depending on who responds to it. We've promised the Ukrainians that we're going to be there until victory. We'll support them. What does victory look like?
It's a very good question, and President Biden knew that he had not, and his administration had not answered that question. And so about a month ago, he put in the New York Times an op-ed where he laid out the answer to your question. And what he said was that the U.S. goal in Ukraine was for a democratic, independent, sovereign, prosperous Ukraine with the means to deter and defend itself against further aggression. So we are there, as you just said, and as President Biden has said, for as long as it takes. We don't know exactly how this is going to end. The Ukrainians are talking about, indeed, there's some indication that they've begun a counteroffensive to push the Russians back out. That's a major effort. The Ukrainians now have some of the weapons they need to do that. And as I say, the President Zelensky has indicated that if the Russians are back into the positions where they were on the 23rd of February, just before they invaded on the 24th of February, then he'll negotiate. And then there's a discussion about a ceasefire and about arrangements so that they can move on about their business. And getting to your question about what does victory look like, as President Biden said, a democratic, independent, sovereign, prosperous Ukraine is what the goal is. But they need to have the ability to defend themselves against further aggression, because if the Russians pull back, just like they have invaded and then stopped and then invaded again, they are likely to invade again. The Russians are likely to invade for the reasons that I said earlier about what Putin wants. Putin wants Ukraine, and he's not giving up. So the Ukrainians need to have some way to seriously defend themselves. And so that's what victory looks like.
The Ukrainians are saying over and over again that they appreciate the support from the United States, but they're worried that it's coming too late. Some people, these are conspiracy theories. Some people think that the U.S. is delaying, for example, on the delivery of these HIMARS missile launchers, postponed for various reasons a Ukrainian victory over the invading forces. Why is it taking so long to get these missiles into Ukraine and functioning to push back? And according to Ukrainian sources, I mean, that's critical right now, really critical.
It is critical. You're absolutely right. It is critical. And my view, it has taken too long. That we should have been providing the HIMARS that you mentioned, but other heavy weapons as well, much earlier. The HIMARS, that's interesting you mentioned that. We've probably all seen these articles over the past couple of days, really, that show what you were just saying, Bill, how effective they are in the hands of the Ukrainians.
Yeah,
and they're so accurate. These rocket launch are so, they can get within a meter. They can go within a meter, and so they don't have to be this bombardment, this area damage that the Russians are using, because the Russians don't have the precision. They just fire and they destroy cities, whole blocks, whole cities. So the Ukrainians are now able, and it should have been earlier. You're absolutely right. Should have been now are able to go after very precise military targets, ammunition depots, headquarters, concentrations of troops. The Ukrainians are very skilled now. One last point, Bill. I asked senior military in the Pentagon, a long meeting with very senior general, and asked him that question: how long? Why does it take us so long? And his answer was not totally satisfying, but his answer was, we had to be sure that, first of all, the Ukrainians were trained on this system. It's a sophisticated system. You don't just send it out there and they jump on it. It turns out, of course, that all the instructions for how to use this are in English, and some of the Ukrainians speak English, but some don't. So there's some training that was necessary, he said. Fair point. And he said it took time to train the Ukrainians, and they would do them at a kind of platoon at a time. So they'd train one platoon and then send them back. And we said, well, why don't you train like 5 or 10 platoons at a time? And he said, well, it turns out that these are the best soldiers, the best artillerymen in the Ukrainian army, and to take them out of the fight for 3 weeks to train them. Actually, the Ukrainians said, well, we can do it in a week. And they could. They're very good at this stuff. But to take them out of the fight was a risk. This is all to say, again, I was not totally satisfied at the answer. And he would agree, and I would agree with you, that it should have been earlier. And had they had them earlier, they'd be doing better right now.
Yeah, especially because this conflict has seemingly it's in like a duel of artillery and missiles, and these HIMARS have an extraordinary range, I believe, of almost 200 miles, and they're super accurate. So and anyway, I think we all get the point. They need these things. They feel they're not getting them soon enough.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed this clip, and I hope they are collectively providing you with a deeper understanding of what's happening in Ukraine. At least that is the intent. That was clip number 3. The clip number 4 is coming up shortly. Thank you for joining us. Again, you can reach me at BillGentile@BillGentile.com. Thanks very much. Stay safe.